If you've ever had that quiet, sinking feeling that everyone around you got handed a map at birth, and somehow yours came back blank, stay with me. Because the next 8 minutes are going to explain something about you that you've probably never had words for. You are not slow. You are not lost. You are not behind. You have been running a completely different operating system, on a completely different clock, and nobody ever told you that. Carl Jung studied this exact kind of person for most of his life, and what he found flips the whole story you've been telling yourself. Because the people who seem to arrive last, they almost never started late. They started differently, and that difference is the entire point. Here's what it looks like from the outside. Everyone else appears to be running on clear pavement, picking careers, picking partners, picking versions of themselves, with this strange, almost supernatural confidence. And you? You're moving through fog. Not because you're afraid of the road, but because you can see things in that fog that they can't. From the outside, it reads as hesitation. It reads as being lost, unfocused, maybe even a little lazy. But what's actually happening inside you is something most people don't have the psychological architecture to recognize. You're not falling behind. You are building something. An interior world, so layered, so complex, so dense with meaning, that the outer world simply cannot receive it yet. And that timeline, the one that says you should have arrived by now, it was never designed for a mind like yours. Which brings us to the first sign. And it starts younger than you'd think. Your childhood felt like watching a movie in a language you hadn't learned yet. Most kids absorb. They watch, they imitate, they become. You watched too, but you couldn't imitate. There was this almost physical distance, like a pane of glass, between you and the world you were supposed to join. You were the one sitting at the edge of the playground, the one staring out the classroom window while the lesson happened somewhere behind you. And people called it shyness. But here's what neuroscience now suggests it actually was: a nervous system running at higher gain. Elaine Aron's research on sensory processing sensitivity found that roughly 20% of people are born with brains that process input more deeply. More activation in the regions tied to empathy, attention, and awareness of subtle detail. And it goes deeper than personality. Studies on mirror neurons, the cells first identified in Parma, Italy, that fire both when you do something and when you watch someone else do it, help explain why some people don't just observe emotion. They catch it. Why a stranger's bad day lands in your chest like it's yours. Why music can put a lump in your throat before you consciously know why. If that's you, you weren't a dramatic child. You were a child taking in the emotional weather of an entire room, while everyone else was taking in the cartoon. And here's what that does to a person. It creates the first separation. That quiet, early recognition that you're not quite like the others. Not better, not worse, just parallel. Close enough to see the main road, far enough to always feel the gap. Sign 2. You were the child who asked questions adults couldn't answer. And there is a very specific loneliness in that. In asking something honest, and watching a grown-up pause, search, and hand you back something you both know is incomplete. Why do people believe things that hurt them? Who are we when nobody's watching? If everyone's pretending to understand, does anyone actually understand? Those aren't the questions of a difficult child. They're the questions of a mind that cannot accept the surface, once it senses there's depth underneath. Jung called this the burden of consciousness, the uncomfortable ability to see through the comfortable illusions that other people genuinely need in order to function. It's a gift, but nobody tells you. It comes wrapped in isolation. And here's the cost nobody warns you about. When you ask the question that exposes the crack in what everyone has quietly agreed to believe, you don't get an answer. You get discomfort. You get that subtle message that your curiosity is inappropriate, that your need for things to actually make sense is excessive, that you should just accept what everyone else accepts without struggling so much. But you couldn't. And that inability was never a flaw. It was the earliest evidence that your mind was built to construct meaning from the ground up, instead of inheriting it pre-assembled. That takes longer. It will always take longer. But what you build yourself doesn't collapse when the world questions it, because you already questioned it, from every angle that exists. Sign 3 shows up in your 20s. And this is the one that causes the most shame. Decisions that felt obvious to everyone else, felt like impossible calculations to you. They picked careers. They committed. They declared entire identities out loud. I'm this kind of person. I want this kind of life. And you stood there. Same opportunities in front of you. and you couldn't move. Not because you lacked ambition, but because you could see too much. Every path came with its cost attached. Every identity you tried on, you could feel the parts of yourself it would quietly amputate. Every yes carried 20 invisible no's that other people genuinely could not perceive. Jung didn't call that indecision. He called it integrity, operating before you had the vocabulary to name it. Your psyche was refusing to commit to anything that required abandoning something essential. So you hesitated. You started things and let them go. You watched people pass you on roads you'd already considered and rejected. And underneath all of it, a quiet terror was growing. What if I never find it? What if I'm just not built to fit anywhere? I need you to hear this clearly. That terror was lying to you. You were never failing to choose. You were refusing to choose falsely. And those two things are not the same. If a sign has hit close to home so far, drop its number in the comments. Because the people reading those comments have walked this same road, and your honesty is what tells them they're not walking it alone. Sign 4. Your 20s were a season of subtraction, not addition. Everyone around you was adding. Credentials, relationships, visible proof that they were becoming someone. And you were doing something that looked, from the outside, like the opposite of progress. You were shedding beliefs you'd inherited but never actually chosen. Walking away from paths that looked perfect on paper and felt hollow in your chest. Losing interest in the approval of people whose values you had never once examined. You were dismantling a self that was never yours. Jung called this individuation, the long, invisible, deeply unglamorous work of separating who you actually are from everything the world told you to be. And he believed it was the most psychologically demanding thing a human being can undertake. The reason it looks like stagnation is simple. You can't measure subtraction on the same scale as addition. Nobody applauds what you removed. Nobody congratulates you for the beliefs you stopped pretending to hold, or celebrates the version of yourself you refused to become. But here's what Jung understood, that almost nobody else did. The people who skip the subtraction, who absorb the identity handed to them and just run, they arrive early. But they arrive hollow. The success comes fast, and then somewhere around midlife, it starts rotting from the inside. Because the life they built was the right shape and the wrong fit. And a life that doesn't fit eventually fractures. You paid your price early. In confusion. In solitude. But you didn't pay it twice. Sign 5. You've always been able to see the ending before the beginning. There's a kind of knowing that doesn't come from logic and doesn't come from experience. It just arrives. Fully formed. An instinct about a person, a situation, a path. And you've probably learned to hide it. Because when you say I just knew, people want reasons. They want data. They want you to explain a process that doesn't happen in the part of the brain that produces explanations. But this isn't mysticism. Psychologists call it pattern recognition, what Daniel Kahneman described as fast, intuitive processing. What researchers call thin slicing. The brain reading thousands of microsignals and delivering a conclusion before conscious reasoning ever catches up. And in your case, that function runs so dominant it can make ordinary decision-making feel almost alien. How do you choose a career when you can already feel which ones will hollow you out? How do you commit when you can already sense a fracture that hasn't formed yet? How do you play a game when you can see the ending, and the ending isn't one you're willing to live in? So you don't. You wait. You hold out for something that passes your own internal test. And while you wait, the world calls you too picky, too slow, too unwilling to just commit to something. You weren't being difficult. You were being accurate. And a lot of the people who dismissed your instincts are now living inside the exact consequences it warned them about. Sign 6. Solitude has never felt empty to you. And this is the most misunderstood one, maybe the most important. You've probably been told that your comfort with being alone is a symptom. Avoidance, withdrawal, an inability to connect. But research draws a very sharp line here. John Cacioppo, who spent his entire career studying loneliness, found that loneliness and solitude are neurologically different experiences. Loneliness is a threat state. The brain treats it like danger. Solitude is restoration. And when you're alone and undistracted, your default mode network activates. The system tied to self-reflection, memory integration, and making sense of who you are. You're not fleeing connection. You're protecting something. That shallow connection interrupts. Your inner world has architecture, rooms, corridors, depth, built across years that most people never spend alone long enough to construct. And Jung didn't see that capacity as a symptom. He saw it as a developmental necessity. This kind of personality needs extended internal dialogue to integrate what it's absorbed, to process what it's perceived, to become coherent. Without it, you fragment. You turn into a reactive version of yourself, responsive to every external demand, and cut off from the only compass that has ever actually worked for you. So if solitude has always been where you find yourself again, you're not broken. You're doing precisely what this personality has to do to become whole. Which leads us to the final sign. And it's the one that means the shift has already started. Sign 7. You've stopped apologizing for your timeline. And it happens quietly, usually without announcement. Often so gradually, you only notice it looking backward. You stop explaining. You stop justifying why you're not where other people are. You stop translating your internal pace into a language the outside world can approve of. That's not defensiveness. It's something far quieter and far more durable. It's coherence. That moment when your inner world and your outer life finally start pointing the same direction. And after that, everything changes shape. You don't move faster. You move more precisely. Your decisions carry weight because they come from alignment instead of anxiety. Your words land because they're no longer padded with apology. And that person, the one who finally arrives, is rare. Not because they're special, but because most people never survive the subtraction long enough to reach what's on the other side of it. A childhood spent watching from behind glass. Questions no adult could answer. Choices that refused to come easily. A decade of shedding that looked like failure. An intuition that saw endings before beginnings. A solitude that was never emptiness. And finally, an arrival so quiet that nobody applauded, because it didn't need applause. You were never behind. You were on a different path entirely. One that simply can't be measured by the instruments the world uses to measure progress. The wandering wasn't wasted. The solitude was an illness. The delay wasn't failure. It was incubation. It was the slow drawing out of a self that nobody could have handed you, only waited for. And all that doubt you carried about your own timeline, it was never proof that something was wrong with you. It was proof that you were being measured against a standard that was never built to hold someone like you. So here's the thought I want to leave you with tonight. The world will always reward the people who arrive first, but it remembers the ones who arrive whole. This is Decoded Psychology. If this reached something in you that's been waiting for words, subscribe. Because the next video goes deeper into the one thing this personality type almost always gets wrong about love. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.